Hello, and welcome to the Kangaroo Leadership Podcast, sponsored by MaxFab Consulting, the podcast that embodies the spirit of progress and resilience by showcasing inspiring leaders and entrepreneurs who exemplify the remarkable traits of kangaroos. Those traits of adaptability, agility, courage, resilience, empathy, vision, authenticity, and continuous learning are what we want to find in our leaders and what we're going to bring to you today. So sit back, get ready to enjoy another episode of the Kangaroo Leadership Podcast. Welcome back to the Kangaroo Leadership Podcast. It hasn't really been that long, and I love this. We're doing this virtually. You can see our faces. Sometimes you got our voices, depending on if we're in studio. But there's no way that we could do this today because Kim is about, 2,500 miles away from me. And in fact, I will tell you, I consider her a close friend and a confidant, and she knows that because I know she's 2 hours ahead. So at 6 o'clock in the morning when I'm stressing about something, I can get on the text and I send it to her and she answers, which is awesome. And we have never physically been in the same room. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about maybe some connection today and how that works into our leadership stuff. Hey, Kim and I had a conversation before we came on that we might hedge on a little bit that I think is great, but I want to set the stage this way. The reason Kim's on this show, and she probably should have been on sooner, is she has a level of experience, a level of courage, and a story, which I'm going to make her tell, and a story that's not a straight line. You know, a lot of us in leadership, we say, well, I'm in healthcare leadership, or I'm in, I was in the military. You guys all know my story. And that's kind of our leadership journey. Kim's is all over the map, and we have spent so much time talking about simple things and everything from child protection to other things, and where you're from and why you're where you're at.
Yeah.
So the other thing is that she's written a tremendous book. We're going to talk about that as we go through. And Kim, I'll let you let everybody know how to get your book and how to get a hold of you, because one of the big things is that I feel privileged to be able to offer the rest of the world, whoever gets to this podcast, you, and I've been doing that. So,
thank you.
This the standard going in question, Kim, is tell us about Kim Benoit.
That is such a big question. And it was so funny because I feel like that's such a hard question. There's like simple answers to that, but like, that's a big question. At the core, like I was born and raised in Southern Louisiana. Benoit is definitely a Cajun name. And, so yes, for people who wonder, I absolutely can cook and I love to cook. It's like every Cajun person, I think it's just a requirement growing up is that you have to know how to do that. But from a very young age, I always had kind of a wanderlust. And so when I was coming to the end of high school, I just was looking to go as anywhere and everywhere I could. And my parents, who I give a tremendous credit to, because their whole thing was, well, if you get the scholarship, you can go. And so you want to talk about motivation to do a great job is like, well, if you want it, work for it. Which was pretty much a philosophy that was ingrained in us very young, is like, you can do whatever you want to do, but you got to go work for it. Like nobody's going to give it to you. My dad, by the way, is a vet. So he was an MP in Vietnam. And so I think there's some very strong characteristics that come with the military. So like my dad was all about like perseverance, and it didn't matter if it was the tennis team or like exams and grades or whatever. It was like, you got to stick with it if you want it. And
Right.
if you want it bad enough, you'll make it happen. So I did. I got a scholarship and I went really far. I went to Macon, Georgia, because, that's far enough away from Southern Louisiana. And pursued psychology there and had a great experience, got published very early, which is not common. I think it's probably more common now, but back then in the 90s, it wasn't as common. And I always thought I was going to be a professor. But so basically around that time, I started really understanding. I was fascinated by people and behavior and deviant behavior. Like, why do people do what they do? Why do we attribute different motives and intentions if it's a male versus a female, or this ethnic group versus that ethnic group, when it's the exact same offense? And that probably started me on the path. So that's how I ended up getting a master's degree in criminal justice and eventually another master's degree in clinical psych. And I primarily worked with incarcerated populations. My first grown-up job, as you mentioned, I was a child protection investigator for the for a rural area in Louisiana, which was an incredibly formative experience. Um, as you know, as a young 20 something, like walking into crack houses and removing babies and having to appreciate the difficulties of parenthood when you surely aren't one yourself. And poverty, just understanding the importance of education and poverty and social resources and all that fun stuff. So I'll pause there
Yeah, no. It's so I'm like I told you,
because that's a whole lot just right there.
this is I know, and there's so much in there. We'll unpack some of that, and there's some other things that I know that I'll just lead you into that I think are important. Can you do me a favor and go back, because we're going to hedge on this all the way through because of our
Sure.
passion about workplace leadership, and
Yeah.
you and I talked about, it's horses for courses. Not every leader is for everybody, and leaders, we have to be chameleons and kind of morph. But
Yeah.
can you talk about the phenomenon that you told me? This will make you smile. That you told me about. Sometimes they would send you into the crack house to work on finding out the information that you needed to handle the child protective stuff, and how people perceived you because of your age and your stature, how
Yeah.
people perceived you, and how that broke down barriers because of their assumptions. Because I'm big on
Oh,
assumptions. Yeah.
yeah. So, okay. So we're going to frame this a little bit. So I was like in my early 20s and they used to call me like back then, totally aging myself. But they said I was like a little Ally McBeal, because I had my little suits and because I was a professional and that's what, my parents taught me to do. Um, and in all candor, like I was walking into homes where sometimes they didn't have electricity or they didn't even have or they did sometimes like you were just walking into very unknown situations. And I think because I looked so young and I looked so innocent, and I surely learned a lot when I was doing my investigative training because I got a lot of that from the sheriff's deputies I partnered with and all the law enforcement people I worked with. They all treated me like I was a kid. And I was like, well, this is great because I'm not a kid. I'm actually pretty freaking smart and I have a master's degree already. So like I got some things going for me, but I quickly learned that if you let people just treat you like a kid and you play into that in a weird way, like people wouldn't even hide stuff. So like parents who had like drug paraphernalia in places that they shouldn't have, and because they just assumed I wouldn't know what that was. And then I would show up and do what I needed to do. I followed the letter of the law completely. But it was interesting what I was able to get people to tell me because they just thought I was too young and too naive to figure it out, or that I was too nice and I would like let them go, or I wouldn't take something as seriously because I just would get people talking, which, if you've ever watched a Dateline episode or anything, if you can get people talking, they will tell you everything you need and you just kind of play that part. And no, it was great because like I would be one way when I was in their house interviewing them, and then when we would get to court to adjudicate the finding, and I show up with all the stuff that I had, and I would show up as Kim, the investigator, not Kim, just oh look at me, little old me, just trying to figure this out. Like, it was interesting because I found people underestimated me very quickly because they thought I was young and stupid, and I'm always mindful about that. Like when we talk about young people now, is that there's a lot of that of like, well, these young people just don't know. Well, I was treated the exact same way. And yeah, there's tons of stuff I didn't know. Um, but also there was a lot that I did. And because you underestimated me, I was able to actually sometimes do my job better than I would have had people actually saw me as a threat or perceived me as the big bad government coming to like invade their house because they were beating their children.
So talk about that. Keep going, because now you're living in Washington D.C. or Virginia, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that whole place is run by 20 somethings. My son happens to be one, and his fiance happens to be one, right? They're all run by 20 somethings, very,
Yeah.
very capable 20 somethings. But talk to me about how that translates and take us a little bit through how you come out of that life. You get into healthcare, you get into human resources.
Yeah.
You're obviously fascinated with humans, but there that
In
story that
all
you
their messiness, I'm fascinated by our
I,
messiness. Can I just say that?
well, and the thing is, you wrote the book We've All Done It because you don't want
Yeah.
to let anybody off the hook, right?
Yeah, including
Which
myself.
right, but you're very forgiving.
Well, you have to be,
The
because
grace, the grace.
yeah,
What?
well, and sometimes it's not easy. Like, I'm not saying it's easy,
No, that's
but
right.
that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to understand that we all are fallible. We're all going to do the same things. Like, just like those people I worked with called me a clueless 20 something and I needed to sit down and shut up. I have maybe caught myself thinking the same thing. And I was like,
Mhm.
whoa, how fast did that happen?
Yeah.
Because, um, you know,
And
I don't consider myself too old, but like I easily will find myself sometimes falling into a trap of not, how do you balance that idea that you are young and you haven't had a lot of life experience, yet you have a lot of intelligence and critical thinking capability that can get you to a certain point. So how do you value that and respect it? Um, but also gently guide people to understand that there still may be some pieces they don't understand that can give better context or create a better solution. So I think that's
so
what you're talking about.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's hard.
and so keep going because we talked a little bit about this and some phenomenon that in my world right now. Um,
I think, yeah.
so so
I
you
think the
you
biggest
develop
thing is we're
habits,
so
right?
different. Yeah. So one of the things I think is fascinating about people, and so one of the things that's huge, and I can't, like, there's not a single day that goes by that I don't see some referencing of like generational titles. And it's funny because I was reading something and I was talking to somebody recently, and I was saying when we were growing up, we weren't referring to the elderly population as the greatest generation. We weren't calling our parents boomers. Like there was labels, but we didn't really leverage labels the way we do now. And I almost find it's incredibly limiting because I know some little Gen Zers that knit better than my mom does. And like, or who, you know what I mean? Like there's some stereotypes that we box ourselves into in how we approach people. And I think when you translate that into leadership, it becomes very hard because one, we now have such a tremendously diverse in age and experience in the workplace. You know, just like the older generations lived through their challenges, you've got millennials who have lived through, maybe they didn't live through Vietnam and those kind of things, but they've lived through kind of wars of their own. Like I was, talking about like the fact that they've lived through more school shooting drills like than I never had that. Like I never had the thought that somebody was going to come in and shoot up my school. Like I was talking to a friend of mine several months ago and they locked down the school because there was an active shooter, but because they're still figuring it out, her daughter called her panicked. The guy was a mile away. But like how traumatized we're raising children and people to be. So like their frame of reference of what is safe and what is communication, like it's just so different. And so we as leaders have to start tailoring it not necessarily to a label, but to a person. So a lot of what I talk about, and I talk about somewhat in the book, but in a lot of the work I do is around engagement and retention. And what do we do as leaders that create environments where people want to stay, intentionally and unintentionally? Like sometimes we do things and we don't even realize we're doing it. But one of the things that I have found is leaders want to have one way of engaging with their team. They want to have one way of giving feedback, one way of giving recognition. And that's just not going to work because you have people that are in such different places and need to be engaged in such different ways. Um, and I think it makes leading harder because I think in older generations, you could just have that single approach. And in today's time, you can't. You really have to know your people at a very deep level and you have to engage with them at that level where they want to be seen and understood. So like compared to when I was a 20-year-old and people were telling me to sit down and shut up, I just had to sit down and shut up. Like however they wanted to engage with me, I had to engage with them in that way. That is not the standard today.
What,
Today is
what
like
what's changed?
I think
Besides,
society has changed.
besides the fact that they can quit, it's easier to quit these days
I
because
think
there's a,
society has just
okay,
changed. Like there's so much I don't know. I think that I just think it's just so
when did,
different. I think there are more options. And I think that you have a younger generation that has been brought up to talk more about stuff, to challenge things, to challenge
sure,
authority.
okay,
Because I surely didn't. Lord have mercy. Like,
right.
you know, I grew up in a certain home, like that was not okay. But I find that there's a shift that's taken place that like it's the expectation authority should be challenged, that everybody's opinion matters and should be considered. I know in some cases people will say that's a great thing. And I know some leaders I worked with who's like, that is the worst thing. I think it depends on the scenario and I think it depends on the situation and definitely the industry. Like to your point, in emergency preparedness, like there are set things that need to happen and
Mhm.
there's not necessarily going to be time to hear everybody's opinion because it's time there's a sense of urgency and we know tried and true what works versus if you're in DC trying to solve a policy decision.
Mhm.
um you might have to sit and be willing to think about unconventional ways of approaching a problem because we know what has happened before hasn't worked. So I think we have to, there's a requirement. And I do think social media plays a part in this too,
Mhm.
is it opens people's eyes that they can be different. They can have different expectations.
Perfect,
Um,
perfect segue.
and it's the idea that like there is endless opportunity, right? Because we're not just like your state or your local community. You're now a global workforce. You're not just a local workforce.
So tell me why, and talk about where you hedge on this in the book, because let's just say in a perfect world that your vision, mission, values, and expectations are completely clear. Total clarity.
Okay.
Now, and you know that that's almost impossible in large organizations. You can say these are my expectations, and you're always going to get I didn't get the memo or whatever it was, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So explain to me why some of those things should be negotiable, why they are, and then how to navigate that, right? So if you look at the kangaroo, right, kangaroos can physically only move forward,
Yeah.
right? And so when they look at things, they have to navigate differently because a huge portion of their options, the options that we have, are not there because they can't go backwards. They have to go forward. So you have to move forward through an organization. But when you have generations that
Hmm.
all have different interpretations of expectations. I'm a military guy. I'll be 59 in a couple of months. When somebody says, these are my expectations, those are in the forefront of my mind in everything that I do, right? Because you're trying to meet that expectation.
Correct.
Not so much, and as you get younger, not so much. They're squishier and they're not hard.
Well, you're balancing like your leader's expectations with your expectations, right? And so I feel like where things end up getting really off is when leaders don't actually know what are the expectation of their employee? Like what are their goals? What are their objectives, right? Because that's what's going to reinforce them and that's going to affect how you engage with them. That's going to affect your strategy of like how you're keeping your team balanced. So historically, most people, their goal is if I show up and I do a good job, I'm going to get maybe a little extra money each year and eventually I'm going to get promoted.
Mhm.
um and there's definitely been a move towards moving up that upward mobility
Right,
in like 2 years, 1 to 2 years. I
right,
remember when I first started out it was 3 to 5. So there's this idea of if I show up, I hold up my end of the bargain, then you're going to do XYZ for me. But that conversation doesn't always happen. And that's where I think a lot of things get off. So for instance, for you, you're going to show up and you're like, here are the expectations that have been given to me. I'm going to go execute. Whereas you have a younger person who's just in a different place in life too.
right.
And let's be honest,
Sure.
they have energy, they've got student loans that you and I probably
or
didn't
or or
have.
kids, or yeah,
Just a lot like
brandy
so they're
relationships, all of that. Yeah.
because this is part of what I talk to people about is like, unless you know your team, you may not know what their motivations actually are. And so understanding, like, they want to understand, they may make an assumption that if I do these things, I'm going to get promoted in a year. Um, but you have to have that conversation. Like, what are your goals? Who do you want to be? What do you want to be doing in a year? Are you still wanting, like, let's just have, this is an ongoing conversation, no promises made. But as a leader, how do you plan for your team if you don't know what their expectations are of you? Of, if I show up and I do this and I knock it out of the park, I go above and beyond, like, am I just going to get a meets expectation, pat on the head, and like do it again next year? That's probably not going to work out well. And so, and that I think could fly 10 years ago. That can't fly today. And so that's why I say you have to know your people at a much deeper level. So another example I'll give you is a good friend of mine who I've had on my podcast. Her name is Erin Dallas, and she's amazing. And she has zero desire to be a leader. None. That is not, she loves what she does. She loves honing her craft. She's in sales. She loves the hunt. Like, the energy she gets in her voice when she talks about her work is phenomenal. But one of the things she's had to fight against is she has no desire to ever be a leader. But that's counter to what most people ultimately want. So she has to be very vocal with her leadership of that. No, don't put me in leadership training. I don't want that. That's not remotely on my expectations or goals. If you try to do that, then I will leave, because that's not what I'm interested in doing. You're going to try to make me become somebody or do work that doesn't fulfill me. And so it's like, because that's like the counter, which I think is great, to what most people want is, how do I climb the ladder as fast as I can? How do I get to a certain title, certain pay? Like, is
Sure.
that what motivates you? Then you need to know that as a leader. If it's somebody who's like, no, I just really want to learn how to do this job really well, then that's a different motivation. That's a
Right.
different development strategy for that team member.
So go through your experience as a senior HR executive, working with highly accomplished executives, everything from operating officers to, executive officers, going through that. And then take us through what you just described.
Yeah.
And then give us why there's gaps, because we all know that I'm probably right at the top of most employers' head scratching is retention, turnover, and recruitment.
Yeah. So, yeah, a whole lot of life happened, to end up in HR. So I ended up doing a couple different things. So just to give you like how my path meandered, I was working and living in New Orleans, working for a neuropsychologist, and which was very exciting work to really understand the science behind how our brains actually work. And I was there during Hurricane Katrina, which, you want to talk about an interesting study of leadership. There's
I
lots of classes
I
and books written on
I
that.
I, I wrote my master's capstone on Katrina, so
Whew,
I
it was
get
an
it.
interesting time.
Yeah.
Whole different topic. But anyway, as a result of that, I ended up making some changes, and I ended up moving out of kind of the healthcare environment at that time, and move in like mental health component, and moved more into consulting. I worked for a consulting company for a little while, and then by a chance encounter on an airplane. So I just want to encourage people, like, I don't know how many Swifties are out there, this whole idea of an invisible string or whatever. I will tell you, some of the most amazing things in my life have happened as a result of random being just in the right place at the right time. But I ended up being seated. I was taking a mental health break from Katrina and visiting a friend in Minneapolis. And I was seated next to an executive at Target, and we just got to talking about Hurricane Katrina. And at the end of the flight, and I was not looking extra special, I was in like one step above pajamas. It was a mental health flight. Like, I wasn't trying to impress anybody. And he handed me his card and he just said, send me your resume. And long story short, I ended up working for the corporate offices of Target on an innovation team, related to safety, theft, and fraud of people, property, and brand. So our job, things from like building design to camera strategy and those big red balls on the outside, like, people coming up and saying, "Can I help you find something?" Like there's things in the store still to this day that I've seen that is related to work I did when I worked for them. Which is just kind of crazy how you can take a criminal justice degree and background, and because what we were doing is we were studying people's behavior in stores and how do we influence criminal behavior in a shopping environment
Right.
without you ever knowing we're influencing your behavior. So it was actually a very fascinating job. But for personal reasons, I ended up moving back home and was very sad to do so, but I did. And I ended up working for a large health system down there and in doing strategic program management and strategy management. Um, and then where I ended up in HR, because this is the part that I kind of gloss over when I talk about everything, is one of the things that I did throughout this entire crazy life of mine. One of the threads was that I was very active in professional development. So I was an adjunct faculty for a small college up in Minneapolis while I was up there. I co-chaired a professional development team at corporate Target. So I was very interested in how do we get people to be better leaders? How do we prepare people for the next step in their career? And so when I went to this health system, they had a leadership institute, and so on my second week there, my boss had pulled me into one of the trainings so that I could start learning the material to take over. And I think at one point I was training, and this wasn't my core job. I was training like at least 100 hours a year. And so I was touching thousands of employees in basic, like like change management
Right. Right.
and a lot of that kind of stuff. So it was interesting because I was doing my job and understanding corporate stuff like working with corporate leaders on an operational level. And then I had the ability to teach, and then watching all these leaders come in. And then we were dissecting and breaking down challenges they were having in how they were able to execute certain things with their team, like stakeholder engagement, which if you view your employees as a stakeholder, that definitely ties to whether they're engaged and you retain them. So there was a lot of stuff that I was doing. So I was seeing the organization and people's ability to lead from like different capacities. And ultimately there was an opportunity to move into to work within the Leadership Institute full time. And so I ended up pursuing that just because I really had a passion for it. Um, and it was fun because I got to get access to a lot of crazy data related to like exit interview data. So a lot of people
Right.
really hunker down on that engagement stuff. And I'm not going to try to get into a war about that. I'm not a big fan of engagement data. I don't always feel people tell the truth in engagement data, especially on small teams, because it's too easy to start picking apart. And every
Sure.
leader says they don't do it. I'm here to tell you they're lying. Every leader wants to figure out
They do.
who
That's
said
as soon
what.
as there's a red dot on some survey, they want to just bore down all the way to exactly who filled it in. I get it.
And 99% of the time, somebody will say, "Well, I know who said that." Like it's just, they can't not do it. And so I think what ends up happening though is people fear retaliation.
Sure.
Even if it wasn't the one, even if they didn't say it, because like
Sure.
it's not
Sure.
named, but like there's the fear of it. So I don't love that. I do love exit interview data though, because when people are leaving your organization, they're not worried about you anymore. They will tell you exactly what was like, why they're leaving, what pain points they had. And it's up to you as a leader in an organization if you're going to choose to listen. And so that was usually what I really paid a lot of attention to. I mean, I looked at the engagement stuff to see if I could correlate it, but man, you'd be amazed at the stuff that came out. It was like there was some hot stuff in there. It was good.
So somewhere in all of that, right? Because this stuff becomes part of your DNA, right? And you
Yeah.
probably can't even remember the name, but you can still see the person sitting in front of you with probably less than perfect language coming out of their mouth and calling out people, and you know if they would have done that 3 months ago, they would have been fired on the spot. But now
Yeah.
they've quit and they're doing this. So somewhere in there, and I want you to also tell us how to get all of this stuff, but somewhere in there you wake up one day and you go, we have all done
Well, it was funny. So, man, So it's, as I talk about other people, I was trying to figure out for myself, like, what did I want to do? Where did I want to go with my life? I had COVID was happening. And so I think everybody was kind of doing that, like, life check of like, where am I? What am I doing? Is this really what I want to be doing? And I just had some like hard realities. Like, I was divorced. I was in my early 40s and I had, nothing tying me down. And I was like, if there was ever a chance to go out and try to do big, bold things, this is probably the moment to go try and do big, bold things. And a book was not in my to-do list. Like, that was not on my dream list. That was not a bucket list thing. Cause some people have that. Like, I want to write a book. It came as a
Me.
result of I was having drinks with I had left to decide to kind of go out on my own and work as a consultant and speaker and leadership coach. And we were having drinks and we were talking about leaders that we liked and leaders that we didn't, and which leaders we thought were good people, but they just were really, excuse my language, shitty leaders. Like, they
Mm.
didn't know how to hold people accountable. They had favorites. And after like me, I was joke. I was like, after glass three, I had a lightning bolt moment where I thought, I wonder how many people who've worked for me or with me are having a similar like conversation somewhere or feel similarly about me.
Yeah.
And very quickly I realized, oh, their faces, like the faces started filling in pretty quickly. Um, and that was kind of the genesis of how do we start to have honest reflection about
Mhm.
who we are and how we show up. And what is that and if we're really honest with ourselves when we don't show up as the person we hope we would be, then how do we acknowledge that so that we can get better and do better in others and when we are faced with similar situations in the future.
I love it.
So
I
yeah,
love.
that's where that was the start of that.
No, I love it. So, how do we get your book?
Go to Amazon is probably
Okay.
the easiest way and Google it. If you're really super lazy, you can go to my website, kimberlyjbenoit.com.
I,
And there's a
I
link there, but yeah, that you can
go,
find it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble.
go to her website. Say it again.
It's kimberlyjbenoit.com.
Right. Or for you non-Louisiana people, Benoit.
Benoit. That's how I
Yeah,
know. Like,
that's
that's how I always know it's a telemarketer. Like, if
yeah,
or
yeah.
somebody who doesn't really know me, I'm like, oh, well, good try,
Kimber,
but no.
KimberlyJBenoit.com. Here's what I want you to do besides go to her website and buy her book. I want you to read about her and I want you to sign up for her newsletter
Thank you.
because yeah, no, it's necessary. And normally I get, because our time is different. Normally I get your newsletter when I'm thumbing through stuff, usually probably just waking up and laying there. So I get a good read and it's always inspirational. And sometimes I have to send you a text and go, hey, what ran you down this rabbit hole, which is usually, somebody you ran into or those type of things. So, so take us to the next step
Yeah.
because I think you've convinced all of us that we've all done it. I think
Yeah.
you've convinced all of us that this is complex. I
Yeah.
think you've convinced some of us that we need to be more malleable, more open-minded, do more exploration. These are the things I talk
Yeah.
on, closing the 25-yard gap. And we are imperfect at all of this.
Oh God.
I
Yeah.
I like to call it horses for courses, right? And just because you show up, you're not the horse for that person's course. And those
Yeah.
are real things. And so people need to have options to either move on or to find another place to land. So tell me, between we've all done it and our imperfections, make this easier for everybody that's listening. And
Mm.
if you can't, then tell us that it's going to be hard forever and that we just need to work hard.
So here's where I'll start. Um, if you find that no matter where you go, you experience the same kind of drama, chaos, or like negative behavior, no matter which job, no matter what company, I would say that is probably a sign you should do some self-reflection. Um, 'Cause you know what I'm talking about. Like, you've met these people where it's like,
Oh,
no matter
oh,
where I go, it's always the same thing. And sometimes it can be industry specific. I'm not gonna,
right.
lie to you about that. But one, I what I usually say is you can never control anybody else. And so if you are in a, like what I call a toxic situation, because we all have different definitions of what is toxic for us. But if you find yourself, you're just, it's a lot of drama. What I always tell people to do is like, okay, one, you got to figure out what role are you playing, because we're not all victims here. Rarely, like, like if you have a mentality of, well, if you did, like, if you're gonna give it to me, you better be able to take it. Like, then you're slinging it just as hard as somebody slinging it at you. So you may have been a victim in the beginning, but now you're feeding the fire. So
Right.
like, I encourage people to understand, like, what role are they actually playing? Like, do you know? Um, and then the second thing I always tell people is we have to get better at being kinder, one, to ourselves. Because I don't know about other people, but like, I'll beat myself up after something and be like, man, I wish I'd have said X differently. I wish I'd have done this differently.
Guilty.
Okay, first off, that's a losing battle, right?
Right.
Like, you can't go back and change anything,
Right.
but you can say, okay, here's where I would have done something different. Okay, this is my learning moment. If I could go back and do it again, what would I
Right.
change? Don't sit
Right.
and chew on it forever,
Right.
but figure it out, journal it if you need to, whatever it is that works for you. And then the third thing I tell people is, then you got to go talk to somebody who's not in it. Like, you got to go talk to somebody who's not immediately involved in the situation, who's going to challenge the narrative you have in your head. Because sometimes we, yes, Dave, you and I, are the fun and dysfunction.
Yeah.
And if we can't figure out what role we are playing that is driving the chaos, then we can't honestly figure out what our solutions are. So, like, if you start off, like, I worked with this woman, and I love her. She's one of my favorite clients ever, 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 because she came to me and she's like, I think this is coaching stuff is BS. I just want to quit. I hate everybody. I hate my boss. I hate everybody. The only people I love are my team, and because we are just beaten up. Everybody takes us for granted, and they just pile on us. And after 6 months of working with her, it was maybe halfway through when we could start peeling back like stuff. We came to the realization that she was actually, she admitted before I even called her on it that she was part of the problem, because she had created a narrative in her head. And so every conversation she had was based on a narrative she had created, that all these people hated her as much as she hated them. And so she just came at them guns a-blazing, every conversation, every meeting. And so what happens when, I don't know about you, but what happens when somebody attacks you
Right.
or you feel like you're being attacked? You attack back.
Right.
So it only fed this narrative in her head. And so once we changed that story and got her to change her behavior, because that story maybe wasn't so true. Let's see if that story really is true, right? And it changed the dynamics with all of her peers, because she realized that she was driving in their narrative, she was a bully. And the minute we started to maybe say, well, could some of that be true? Well, what if, like, what would you do differently if you thought you were being the bully? Like, if you could
Well,
do this differently. And so that's where I get people to say it's not impossible. And I'm not saying it's magic. And you may end up in the same place and say, you know what, I want to quit and leave.
sure.
But in her case, like, it changed how she saw herself. She changed how she saw her team and her peers. And she actually ended up doing incredibly well and stayed with her team, and became a really productive, like, highly engaged leader, which is like a success story. But it all starts with, you can't really worry about what other people are doing. You really got to double down on, what are you doing, and are you proud of what you're doing? What do you need to change? And then once you start really digging that, then you know what your options really are. Because quitting may not be the only option you have. You may have some other choices in there.
Right. I had a boss one time when he hired me. In fact, we hired on a video conference. I was in Iraq. He was in the United Arab Emirates, and he was going back to a base, and he was hiring a chief. And he hired me. So we hadn't been physically in the same room. We only had this to kind of build a quick relationship. And I was leaving, he was leaving. I had to go to North Dakota, pack up stuff, move. You get it. You get all that.
Yeah.
And so besides church on Sunday, which I stood behind him long enough for him to turn around, shake my hand, say, "Hey, how's it going?" And we were gone. Even after that, we were gone. We didn't have time to talk. So the very first time that I actually walked into his office, he stopped me and he goes, "We can't have any conversation until you read the mirror." And he had this beautiful mirror. It was probably, if you went from your waist to the top of your head, it was probably that big.
Oh, wow.
Beautiful mirror. And it was etched. And it had a saying on it. And I can't give you the whole thing, but you could read it. You could read on the mirror. And the total paraphrase of the whole thing is that when you think things are down and out and everybody's screwing up and the world's, just not working for you, you need to come here first. You need to look in the mirror first, because
Yeah.
you're probably at some level have something that you can do. And there's actually magic in that. If you can function at that high of a maturity level as a leader, there's some magic. That's all kangaroo stuff, right? Adaptability, agility, all these kind of things, right?
Yeah.
Continuous learning. If you can function at that level and take that and go, like you said, take that and go, okay, because not everybody stays. You had people quit you at some point in time. I've had
Well,
people.
and the truth is you may like do your self-awareness, go have somebody challenge your narrative, and you may end up in the same place. Like, I'm not saying everybody
Right.
has this massive epiphany. Sometimes you are just in a place, in an environment that is not conducive or the right place for you.
Yeah.
But if you just start with the assumption that you're a victim and that you are completely innocent in everything that is happening, well, that's not really doing the deep work that actually will help you be better when you go to the next place. Because if you ask any person whether they quit or whether they stay, or like, if you could do anything different, like if you could go back and have one conversation different or handle a meeting or an encounter differently, which one would it be and what would you do? Why? And what would you do differently? Every single person will say yes. And so that tells me that somewhere along the line, there's something you probably need to learn about how you could have done something different. Now, granted, you may have stood up for yourself and said something that would have led to a different outcome, or I don't know, like there's just a million different things, but that's the work. And I think that's the responsibility. Um, I just think that's our responsibility, whether we're an employee, whether we're a leader. I think it's really important for leaders because we control so much of our team members' lives. Like, we have a lot of power. And so if we're not doing the work to make sure we're showing up as our best selves, which we know we're not going to do every day because we're flipping human, we're not robots, and we're all going to have good and bad days. And, like I tease people about, during the pandemic, we had good and bad months. Like, I saw some of the best leaders I've ever worked with cracking under the pressure of, working, because I was in healthcare at the time, and they were working, 12 to 16-hour days, trying to homeschool kids, trying to find toilet paper, like the navigating, just trying to keep your team engaged, figuring out how you were now going to change an entire industry overnight into something virtual. Like, it was the best people cracked. But again, that's where the whole compassion comes from. Like, we've got to give people that humanity, that some days are just not going to be people's best days. And that doesn't mean they're all evil. Now, I'm not saying that there's not leaders that maybe could deserve that title. I mean, I know there's days I surely did not show up as my best self, and people probably call me a few select names behind my back, which may have been merited on that day because
Right.
of who I showed up as on that day.
Right.
But does that mean that I'm a completely evil person? I don't think so. I think, because I can sit here and say I wasn't my best self on those days, and I maybe didn't apologize or own it as quickly as I should have. But I do better now because I learned from those moments.
So talk about, because you're really on the edge of, and you're doing a little coaching for all of us right now, which we all need. But talk about setting aside. Sometimes we equate our life experience or our titles to enough experience, which means we're not engaged anymore, where we don't seek out mentors, seek out those type of people. We don't do that, and that's stagnant, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you and I talked about my recent stuff over the last couple of days. But
Yeah.
all of those things that you described, and this is not patting myself on the back. This comes from
Yeah.
screwing it up, right? And so all of those things that you described, I did all of that this morning. And I didn't reach
Yeah.
out to just one person. I
Yeah.
reached out to three
Yeah.
and said, listen to this, right? And these are
Yeah.
people that know me, that know what my tendencies are, that know that sometimes those things don't play out perfectly, right? And guess what? They didn't let me off the hook completely.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, and
I
that's what you need is like you need that. You need the person you know is going to challenge you and is going to maybe make you a little uncomfortable. I have those people in my life that I know, and you know what? I may not walk away saying agreeing with what they're telling me or their perspective, but I like that I get challenged because I have to think it through for myself and
yes,
say, this is what I think to be true. But I hear you and I understand like what you're saying to me. And sometimes I'll walk away and I go, wow, I am like, I'm not living up to who I want to be. Like, and you're really forcing me to see that for myself. Um, no, I think that there's no title, there's no age. And quite frankly, I think the higher you go in leadership, the more you need somebody who's going to challenge you on your thought. Because I think we have a lot of, I don't know, that's pretty, was about to make a very broad generalization. I do think there can be times when when people get to a certain level of leadership where their responsibilities become so strategic and they become, especially when they're leading successful organizations, that they start to like believe their own shit.
right,
And I think the higher you go, the more you need people around you that are not yes people and more people who are going to make you uncomfortable, challenge what you're doing, speak truth to power, if you will, because I think but I frequently, sometimes I think, and that's why, again, I don't love these engagement surveys, is because I think people read into it what they want to see.
right,
They
right.
will find the
Well,
validation that they are right and they are good,
you
and they're
gave
going to
me
find a way to explain away the things that maybe are telling them that they're not being the leader that they need to be in the moment.
Yeah, I'm gonna have you tell this story because I don't do it as well as you, even though I steal it. And I did at the last conference I just spoke at. I'm gonna help you out here though, because it's actually in a book. And God rest his soul, he just died a couple of years ago. When Colin Powell was made chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was the lowest ranking 4-star general in the whole Department of Defense. He was the brand newest 4-star general. He jumped over the top of every 4-star in the whole entire Department of Defense to being the leader of the whole department, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, right? And the first thing that he did, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit out of the book, the first thing that he did was he called a lot of his friends, a lot of his, his inner circle. And he said, I'm getting ready to hire a staff. And he goes, I'm not hiring any of you because I know how you think, and most of it is similar to mine.
Mm-hmm.
And to their shock, a lot of people that had been the antithesis to him ended up on his staff. And the question was, why am I on the staff? And he said, I don't need people to affirm. I know who I am. I know what
Yeah.
my strengths are. I don't need people to affirm. I need the challenge in my life constantly so that we are headed in the right direction. Because just because I have a perspective or a level or a basket of experiences doesn't make that all knowing. And so I
Mm-hmm.
need this extra thing. So that's great. But you told me a story that I love. And like I said, I did it at the last conference very quickly, but you talked about the survey comes,
Yep.
the C-suite gets the survey,
Yep.
it starts to get
Yeah.
whatever
This like, yeah.
machinated.
Well,
And
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 it's
and
like
then
very clear.
and then they ask you to do something though, didn't they?
I'm trying to remember how exactly I
Uh,
told the story.
so they get the survey, they look at the data, and out of the survey, they tell you, go build training for the directors and managers.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So tell us.
Like
And
I'm kind of
you're
laughing because I have a couple of survey
and
stories
and
that I'm like, wait, which one did I
and
tell you?
and you're in the middle of it, right?
Yeah.
And you
Oh, yeah.
stay
So then I
out.
went
You stay
and
out of the
then,
fray, and you say you
well,
need
so
some
the
data,
hard
right?
part is, so this particular example, so because of the access that I have, like, so the survey is basically saying, like, tells you a certain thing. And they said, go build some training. And then, but when you start actually talking to the people who are in the position and like get into what they're doing day in and day out, you realize like that training is not going to solve a problem. Like it's a symptom. Like the engagement survey is simply like it's the symptom. It's not the actual, speaking in healthcare terms, it's the symptom. It's not the
Sure.
cause.
Right.
And so coming back and trying to say, hey, I don't think this is the right thing. Like this is going to be, it's a ton of work. It not only to build what they're asking to build. Um, and when you think about the complexity of like what the role actually is, it's going to be a heavy lift for these leaders who are already overworked and are telling you in the survey that they are burnt out, they're over it, like all these things. And they were like, nope, nope, this is what we're going to go do. You go build this. Like,
This,
because basically what they were asking for, like, they wanted us to build like training around like how to do better scheduling and
mhm,
how to do like basic, like operational things, like almost like a to-do manual.
right.
When the truth was, what they were actually seeking was is they didn't have enough staff. They had such high turnover. So they ended up having to step into operational roles that they were not, either they shouldn't have been, or they just didn't have enough to do. There was not clarity around role definition. So that same job title meant different things from like region to region.
Right.
And so like it was, and so that's what they wanted. They wanted clarity. They wanted like some financial support to make sure we had viable operational models. And I got told to go build training around how to have, better conversations and how to use like the scheduling system better. And I was like, like, and again, like I will go do what you tell me to do, but that is not going to solve your problem. And it just seems like it's so frustrating because like they're telling you what's wrong
I am
and you can't fix it.
I'm so going to put words in your mouth, but but this is where we kind of fell, because the things in the survey dictated the work should have been being done in the C-suite.
Correct.
And so when you and I dissected this last time, and this is what I say when I talk, when I put your picture up there with your book and say, you need to give her a call. We might end up in Montana again, or Montana next year together, which would be fun.
I need to get out there. I've
Yeah,
never been to
I
Montana.
know. I'll find space for you. You may not leave. You may not leave. Um, so but here's what I say is the executive tells you go do this, and you
Yep.
come back and you say, this is all good, but we probably need to look more internal. And the executive
Yeah.
says to you, you're not doing what I asked you to do.
Correct.
Which at that point in time,
Just go do it.
the leader has said, I want you to solve my problem, not the problem.
Correct.
Because as soon as they can put a checkbox next to all of these red dots and say, we've addressed it, they move on.
There's your action plan. Cause if for all the leaders out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like if you have a deficiency somewhere on your engagement survey, you have to create an action plan to address it. And I think this is where there's good intention that just completely goes off the rails because you're not actually solving the problem. You're just saying, I've addressed it, but you haven't fixed it. And it's just infuriating to me that we can do better by our people. If we're going to go through the effort to ask them what's wrong and what they like and don't like about where they work and who they work for, then at least have the balls to like
They don't, and you
do
know
it
what?
correctly.
People don't pick low-hanging fruit anymore either. It drives me nuts. Because in those surveys, there's low-hanging fruit. I understand there's only so much time. We got to do work. Well, you can make 1,000 reasons. It's all fear and pain in it. It's all these fear and painful. If we go there, it's a place and that's why there's people like you in the world. If you've got
Yeah.
to go into a deep, dark, scary place, go find a guide. Go find somebody that
Yeah.
has been in those spaces and help them walk you through. But as I write in my book, you have to park your ego.
Well,
You've got to park your ego and understand that you're going to have imperfections.
Well, and I think that's again, like, I think and this is why when you asked that question earlier about when you get to certain levels, do you still need to do this kind of work? And
Mhm.
I often say the higher you go, the more you should do the work. But the problem is your patterns have gotten you where you are. So if you have dysfunctional or toxic tendencies, you've been rewarded for those. That's how you've gotten to the C suite. So sometimes it can be really
That's right.
challenging to get a leader to want to do differently or think differently because they've already been reinforced quite a
Right.
lot of their career that who they are is good.
Yeah.
It
And
really comes down to the culture of
and
the organization.
toxic narcissists only become fully visible when they get to the top. They navigate in their mast as they go. So for
And there's
sports,
so many examples. Like
it's
I'm like laughing. I'm like, if only we had a few examples
yeah,
in the
yeah.
American society right now, but we have quite a few.
There's nobody that's listening to this that can't do a personal example, or somebody that's,
Oh yeah.
in the news on a day-to-day basis. I'll help everybody out for you sports fans out there. How is it that a guy can hit 350 in AAA and he goes to the majors and he hits 190? What happens? What happened in there? And it's because they're uncoachable.
I have no idea. Like I don't know baseball that well. So you
The,
lost me,
the,
but I
the
trust that
hardest
your listeners know.
the hardest thing to do in athletics is to take something round, hit something round, and make it go straight. That's just hitting a baseball. It's the hardest. That's why when you succeed 3 out of 10 times, you go to the Hall of Fame.
Oh,
Anything else you get 30% in, that's considered failure. That's a big F. If somebody wrote 30% on a college paper, you'd just be like devastated. If you succeed 30% of the time in baseball when you're hitting the ball, you're a Hall of Famer. 300 batting average is Hall of Fame batting average.
hmm.
So so
Well,
most so most players don't
you're
succeed.
saying they're just not coachable.
Well, I'm saying if say you have a bad habit, right? Your bad habit may survive the environment that you're in because of the level that you're at. But when you go to the
Okay.
next level, if you don't get that bad habit coached out of you, you're going to fail. Just because you're good where you're at doesn't mean that you're going to be the same level of success at the place that you move unless you do that stuff. The NFL draft is this week. Brand new players are going to get drafted and go to their teams. I guarantee you, if you look at them when they get drafted and you look at them a year later, they're in better shape a year later. They got more muscle. They just
Yeah.
look better, right? Because one, they're getting paid an awful lot of money and they're being told how to work out, how to eat, and to get all the attention that goes along with that. And two, that they've committed to the next level of need. And I think sometimes when leaders transition, instead of doing that, they relax and they go, I'm here now.
So are we
And
talking about Bill? Can we talk about like Bill Belichick is probably the example I
yeah,
think in my
yeah, sure,
mind.
sure,
You know,
sure.
because I mean, but again, like he's been at a certain level, he
Right.
wants to transition and he's having a very challenging time doing that because his patterns are so what they are.
The reason he didn't get a job this year, they let him go in New England. And
Yeah.
you would think he's
I know
probably
football better than I know
okay.
baseball.
Okay, so
So,
Bill Belichick is arguably the best football coach on the planet. Arguably. Okay. All of a sudden he's available. You got teams that there was
yeah.
10 teams that fired coaches. All of a sudden he's available and he doesn't get a job. You know why? Here's what's out in the public. Me being a Miami Dolphins fan, I can totally relate to this because we have Mike
Mhm.
McDaniel. Mike McDaniel is young enough and experienced enough that he can resonate with the players at their level. Bill
Mhm.
Belichick, all these things that you've talked about for the last hour is a Bill Belichick scenario.
Correct.
And so they don't want to bring him in with the Bill Belichick way. They don't want to bring him in because they know it's not going to work. And if he
Well,
can,
it's yeah. And I don't know if see, because I watched the little documentary that they did, which I thought was fascinating. If you haven't seen it, you should see it, called The Dynasty, because it really is a true understanding of leadership, not only for him, but also Robert Kraft, and Tom Brady. Like, so
yeah,
when you think about like players as leaders and how that organization has shifted and changed over time, how people asserted leadership or
Right.
pulled back from leadership. It's a pretty interesting dynamic, but it made sense to me why he wasn't going to get picked up. And just so like the only reason I like Bill Belichick is because they just annihilated the Falcons, that 28-3, that infamous score. Like
Oh,
that's a
when they
big,
came
being a
back, yeah.
Saints fan,
All
it's a big
right.
deal. So,
So, so
but yeah.
the reason I have not watched that show is I'm a Miami Dolphins fan.
Oh, it's fascinating. You should watch it.
Yeah.
You would, I think
It's
you would absolutely,
I
it's so interesting.
I'm sure I would, but I'm a Miami Dolphins fan.
Well, I'm not a Patriots fan, but I
Yeah.
would say I walked away from that show. But this is why, and maybe
Yeah.
again, being the nerd that I am and just fascinated by people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I walked away feeling like I understood Bill Belichick better as a coach and how he just views the world in general and what made him successful for the period of time he was successful. And also where he's going to struggle in that
Sure.
transition. Um, and I also was able to, I don't know, I just walked away having a better sense of like understanding people and how they tick and what they said. And there was just a lot of transparency that they gave, which I was really shocked by. I wasn't expecting as deep as they went,
Right.
but I highly recommend it, even if you're not a Patriots fan, which
No,
I am not.
I
But I found it very educational to be able to
sure.
pull back the curtain a little bit on what that world is really, really like if
Sure.
you are a football fan. And I just have to say this because I know my mom's going to be listening to this podcast. She loves your coach. She thinks he's so cute. I think she has a little
Oh,
crush
you
on
know
him. He's
what?
such a
I,
cutie.
Dolphins fan, we are the most, I think we've all suffered so much. I've been
I
around
don't know
long
if she's
enough. I can
necessarily a
remember.
Dolphins fan, but she's a McDaniels
Tell
fan.
her, tell her, come over to Finn's Nation, Finn's up, and we'll do it. So,
So anyway,
Kim, do me a couple of things as we get close to the end here. I do want you to plug your book again. I want you to tell us how to get a hold of you in all ways, shapes, or form.
okay.
And, and then I want you to tell me, give us one departing piece of advice, your favorite piece of advice. But I also want you to tell us, that it's okay to have
Oh yeah.
help as a leader, no matter how old we are. So if you can do all of that, you'll be,
Okay. So the book.
yeah,
Um, the book is, I wrote this book specifically for leaders. It's very easy. It's not a research, it's not and you can attest this. I wrote this for people like who I was when I needed something to help me just think it through. So it's not a dense book, it's scenario based. And you're going to see yourself or somebody you know in it. And there's a lot of humor in it too, because I believe like we got to start laughing at ourselves. We can't take ourselves so seriously all the time,
sure.
people. Um, but no, it really is just about understanding. Do you know how you show up? Do you know in various situations, do you have a tendency to show up as your best self or do you show up
Mm,
as the worst version of yourself? I feel like for many of us, there are certain situations where we just know something's going to get under our skin and we're probably going to behave in a way that we're not going to like later. So, if you know these things about yourself, how do we get better at preparing for it and planning for it? The second thing I would say, okay, so then you said how to find me. So you can always find me at my website, which I've already said, kimberlyjbenoit.com. I do have a weekly newsletter that comes out and it's not one, it's a little different than yours. It's usually kind of what I'm thinking about
mhm,
or um I really want to create a space where I'm not this person that has every answer. I am not an easy button for people.
sure.
But
Perfect.
what I want is I want people to understand that there is a way forward and there is a way to navigate it, but you've got to be brave enough and courageous enough um to reach out and to say I'm going to try something different. Like I'm
Sure.
going to admit I'm human. I'm going to admit I make mistakes, which we do not do well in our culture right now. Like we are
Sure.
very much in a culture where admitting you've made a mistake is seen as weakness when the truth is like that's the only way you move forward. Um, you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. Like come find me on LinkedIn. I engage with everybody. So if you email me, I typically email you back. Um, normally I do. Sometimes it may take me a day or so, but I promise I do. But I like engaging with people and I like understanding what are their struggles and um because again, like the world is changing very quickly, and the challenges we navigated 5 years ago are very different than the challenges we're going to navigate next year. And
Mhm.
so, I want to make sure that I've got my pulse on what is really happening and how I can help people.
Sure.
So I'd say those two are probably the easiest ways to find me. My parting advice would be, I don't know, I've got a couple. I think for today, what I would say is we have got to stop taking ourselves so seriously. We have got to stop believing everything we think, and we've got to stop thinking that like our way is the only way. Um, and in part to do that and to really candidly do that, I think that's where you have to start reaching out. So whether it's a coach, like somebody like me, somebody like you've got to cultivate those people in your life who are not going to be your hype people. Well, I mean, they can be your hype people, but they're also going to be the people who are going to call you on your shit and are not going to let you get away with something because they're scared to make you mad. Like, you need the people in your life that are really going to be the ones that if you pick up the phone and say, I need you to like check me here, that they will. And there's nothing personal about it. It's that
Right.
those are the people that will make the difference, I think, in your growth the most.
Right.
Um, I think
I
that would
love
be
it.
what I would
I
leave
love it.
people with.
I love it.
Laugh more. Like, we need to laugh more.
I agree.
We don't laugh enough, I don't
I agree.
think.
Well, if you want to live longer, they say people that laugh live as much as 8 years longer, depending on what you want. Hey, so Kim, everybody names their own podcast, and I usually write it down while it's going while we're going through this. So
Oh,
so you get to pick because I have two things. So
okay.
you get to pick.
I
It's
thought you were going to
either
make me make it up on the fly. And I was like,
no,
this is not good.
I just jot it down when you say it and it resonates, then I just jot it down and that's all. So you get to pick between how do you show up
Yep.
or stop taking yourself so seriously.
Ooh.
Or
Probably the first one's the more
how do you show
consistent
up?
one with the
How do,
messaging. I would probably go with the first one.
how do you show up? Okay, that's it. All right, folks, that's the Kangaroo Leadership Podcast. We're all over the place, and that's just kind of the way we roll here. This one's a big deal to me because I think that Kim's a treasure, and if you don't take advantage and just get in the book and looking her up, and she said she'll engage with you, no kidding. I mean, she will get back with you, and it's not often that you can have an author and a coach and somebody with this level of experience that will get back to you directly. At some point in time, she's got to charge you for your services, but there's a little bit of free in there. I think anybody that does this gives a little bit of free just because it's the right thing to do. Kim, you don't know how much I appreciate you. You'll hear from me at 6 o'clock in the morning, 2 days from now, going,
Back at you, my
what the
friend.
heck is going on? So
No,
yeah,
I mean, I am so grateful that you have come into my world because just like I value you just as equally. And I love that we don't view the world the same, but we're just as equally passionate
yeah,
about trying to make this world a better place. And so I am grateful for all the challenges you give me all the time because sometimes I'm like, ooh, oh, Dave, you're so right. And so, and I would just say, final word, tell people when they're right. Like, in this world,
absolutely,
sometimes isn't that the best feeling when somebody comes
yeah.
back and says, all right, I know I said this, you were right. Like, I know I love to hear that. So we should be saying that to more people when other people around us are right.
I
So just
I
be kind to people.
I gave a friend really, really direct advice on how to get through a problem this morning. The phone call was all about mentoring, and she's very sharp, very accomplished. And I said, you have to go do this. I didn't even give her an option. I said, you have to do this. She goes, I'm going to do it right now. An hour later, she called me back, and you know what she said?
What?
She said, you're right. She goes, you were right. That's
It's a good feeling.
well, for everybody.
Well, but I
It's
mean,
just a
like, it's
whole
a
thing.
win-win. Like, it's a win-win. Like,
Yeah,
and how often does that happen?
yeah.
Never. So
No,
we've got to
I
take
love it.
these moments.
I,
We've got to do these things for ourselves.
I love it. I love it. Well, special people doing special things, and the best thing that I know is that I don't always have it right. In fact, I'm probably wrong more than I know. But that's why we write it down in a book so people can read about it and maybe not make the same mistakes. And it's all great.
Yes, indeed.
Kim, thanks so much. I'm sure that we'll reciprocate and do this again. But hey, until next time, you tell me how you show up. That's the Kangaroo Leadership Podcast. Out here.